In late June 2007, military jeeps roll into Mutitjulu, a small community of about 1,500 people. 406. In late June 2007, military jeeps roll into Mutitjulu, a small community of about 1,500 people, 460 kilometres southwest of Alice Springs. A resident named Dorothea Randall later described the mood in the community that day to a national broadcaster. She said she'd never seen her family and the people around her so nervous and scared. Some parents in the community genuinely believed the army had come to take their children away. The operation carrying soldiers into communities like this one was given the name Operation Outreach, a phrase that, to plenty of people watching it unfold, sounded uncomfortably close to language already being used at the time to describe military humanitarian missions overseas. It had been 6 days since the federal government announced what it called a national emergency in the Northern Territory. The official name for what followed was the Northern Territory National Emergency Response. Almost everyone, then and now, just calls it the intervention. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Whadjuk Noongar country, and we acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about the Northern Territory intervention, the report that was used to justify it, the sweeping changes it forced onto dozens of Aboriginal communities almost overnight, and what's actually been measured in the years since about whether any of it achieved what it claimed to be for. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses allegations of child sexual abuse, the deployment of military and police into Aboriginal communities, and government measures that suspended racial discrimination protections for an entire population based on race. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people any hour of the day or night on 13 92 76. Alright, let's go back to where this actually started, because the report at the centre of it said something quite different from what the government built on top of it. In August of 2006, the Northern Territory government commissioned an inquiry into the protection of Aboriginal children from sexual abuse, chaired by Rex Wild, a Queen's Counsel, and Pat Anderson, an Aboriginal health researcher with decades of experience in Indigenous health policy. Over the following 8 months, Wild and Anderson's board conducted extensive community consultation across the territory, travelling to remote communities and listening directly to residents, rather than relying purely on existing case files and police records. In April of 2007, they handed their findings to the Northern Territory's Chief Minister, Claire Martin. The report, titled in language from the Arrernte people, Ampe Akelienemane Meke Mekarle, Little Children Are Sacred, found that child sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities was serious, widespread, and significantly underreported. It also did something the government's response would largely choose to ignore. It carefully laid out the underlying causes: poverty, severely overcrowded housing, alcohol, and substance abuse, lack of education and employment opportunity, and the long, compounding aftermath of intergenerational trauma stretching back through the stolen generations and earlier protection era policies we've already covered on this show, and it made 97 specific recommendations, most of them centered on community-driven, locally designed solutions rather than measures imposed wholesale from Canberra. Its very first recommendation simply asked that the issue be formally designated one of urgent national significance by both levels of government, a fairly modest procedural ask compared with what actually followed. 6 days after the report was publicly released, on the 21st of June 2007, Prime Minister John Howard and Indigenous Affairs Minister Mal Braw stood up and declared a national emergency. Howard later defended the speed and scale of the response in starkly framed terms, asking rhetorically what mattered more, what he called constitutional niceties, or the care and protection of young children, a framing that left very little room for anyone to publicly question the method without sounding as though they didn't care about the underlying problem at all. Given how complex and carefully researched the underlying report actually was, 6 days was nowhere near enough time to translate its specific findings into a considered legislative response. What got introduced instead bore only a loose resemblance to what Wild and Anderson had actually recommended. The measures that followed were sweeping. The army was deployed into prescribed communities to handle logistics and surveillance. Extra police were sent in from other states. Compulsory health checks were ordered for every Aboriginal child in the affected communities. Alcohol and pornography were banned outright in designated areas, with signage posted accordingly. Welfare payments for residents were quarantined, with 50% of most people's income converted into a restricted form of payment, eventually known as the Basics Card, that could only be spent at approved stores on approved items, regardless of whether the recipient had ever been investigated for anything at all. Income support was tied directly to children's school attendance. The Community Development Employment Project Scheme, a locally run, genuinely popular work program, was abolished outright, pushing thousands of people straight onto unemployment benefits instead. The Commonwealth compulsorily acquired 5-year leases over Aboriginal-owned township land, and the permit system that let Aboriginal land councils control who could access their own country was substantially wound back. Government-appointed business managers were installed to oversee community affairs directly, in some cases operating out of fenced compounds. None of this was legally possible without one further step. To implement it, the federal government formally suspended the operation of the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, along with the Northern Territory's own anti-discrimination law, specifically so these measures could be applied to an entire population on the basis of race without being challenged as unlawful discrimination. It's worth letting that sit for a second. The legal foundation of the entire intervention rested on temporarily switching off the very law designed to stop governments doing exactly this kind of thing. Wild and Anderson themselves were uneasy about a great deal of what their report had been used to justify. They specifically argued in their own published findings that suspending the Racial Discrimination Act breached a basic principle owed to the Indigenous community of this country, and that the relevant provisions should be opposed outright rather than passed. They also called for the Community Development Employment Projects program to be reinstated rather than abolished. On both counts, the government that had cited their work so heavily as its justification went ahead and did the opposite of what they'd actually recommended. Critics raised an uncomfortable detail almost immediately. The word child or children doesn't appear once across the hundreds of pages of the actual Northern Territory National Emergency Response Act itself. Measures explicitly concerned with land, leases, and the permit system take up a substantial share of the legislation, leading a number of Aboriginal leaders at the time, and plenty of researchers since, to argue that child protection had functioned less as the actual policy goal and more as the politically unchallengeable justification needed to push through changes to land access that had been sitting on conservative wish lists for years already. The media pressure that helped set all of this in motion has its own uncomfortable footnote. A year before the intervention, in June of 2006, the ABC's Late Line program aired a sensational story about alleged abuse in Mutitjulu specifically, built around an anonymous, digitally disguised interview with a man identified only as a youth worker. That single broadcast helped push the Northern Territory government into commissioning the inquiry that became Little Children Are Sacred in the first place. An investigative journalist later established that the man wasn't a youth worker at all, and that key details in his account didn't hold up. The underlying report Wild and Anderson eventually produced was genuine, rigorous, and important. The specific spark that got the whole process moving wasn't nearly as solid. The intervention rolled out across dozens of communities inside weeks, and the reaction on the ground was exactly what you'd expect from a population suddenly stripped of control over its own welfare payments, land access, and local services, with almost no prior consultation. Senior Aboriginal leader Pat Dodson described the government's approach at the time as a regime of coercive paternalism, accepting the urgent need to protect children while rejecting the authoritarian, heavy-handed method chosen to supposedly achieve it. In July of 2009, elders from the Ampilatwatja community, several hours northeast of Alice Springs, staged their own pointed response. They walked out of their government-provided housing entirely and set up a bush camp instead, issuing a statement that described conditions under the intervention as feeling exactly like the old welfare days of the 1960s and 70s, income controlled, autonomy stripped away, dignity treated as optional. They specifically pointed to the basics card system as a daily, visible reminder of exactly whose decisions now governed their household budgets, down to which shop they were permitted to use. It was, in its own quiet way, the same basic act of refusal this show has already covered more than once, walking off rather than continuing to accept conditions designed without you, an echo of the Pilbara strikers and the Kumaragunja walk-off generations earlier, just with a government-issued payment card standing in for unpaid station wages. The federal election that November swept Howard's government out of office entirely, the same election that ended his 11 years as Prime Minister. The incoming Rudd Labour government, despite campaigning on different values and delivering the formal national apology to the stolen generations only months later, in February of 2008, chose to continue the intervention largely unchanged, and in some respects expanded it. Rudd told a state party conference that same year that the policy had made a real difference and that he intended to maintain its momentum, a striking thing to say only months after standing in Parliament and formally apologising for an earlier era of government control over Aboriginal lives. The Racial Discrimination Act remained suspended for a further 3 years under Labor, only fully restored in 2010 under Minister Jenny Macklin. In 2012, with the original legislation due to expire, the Gillard government rebranded and extended the entire framework for another decade under the name Stronger Futures, keeping welfare quarantining, school attendance penalties, and alcohol restrictions firmly in place. The Gillard government did attempt some genuine community consultation ahead of that extension, but even that process was widely criticised afterward as rushed, partisan, and conducted in a way that struggled to meaningfully shift outcomes that had already been substantially locked in years earlier, despite, by that point, a considerable body of independent research finding little solid evidence that the core measures were actually achieving their stated goals. Compulsory income management itself didn't end when Stronger Futures eventually expired either. Versions of the same basic model, later rebranded again as the cashless debit card, continued operating in communities across the territory and were extended into other parts of the country entirely, well beyond the boundaries of the original 2007 emergency, a policy mechanism that's proven far more durable than the actual emergency it was originally designed to address. So, what did get measured? The government's own department later reported that 45 people were convicted of child sexual assault. In intervention, affected communities between 2007 and 2012, compared with 25 convictions across the 5 years immediately before the intervention began. Modest movement that's difficult to attribute cleanly to any specific measure, especially once you account for far more intensive policing, simply detecting more of what had always been underreported. It's also worth knowing that across this same period, more than 85% of substantiated child protection notifications in the Northern Territory were actually classified as neglect rather than abuse, a category far more directly tied to poverty and overcrowded housing than to the kind of crime the intervention was publicly sold as targeting. In 2008, the Australian Human Rights Commission reviewed the available data and concluded plainly that confirmed child abuse statistics for the territory didn't support the picture of endemic, runaway abuse that had been used to justify the entire response in the first place. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, James Anaya, went further still, concluding that intervention breached Australia's international human rights obligations and undermined Aboriginal communities' basic right to self-determination. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. A careful 8-month inquiry that named poverty, overcrowding, and a lack of opportunity as the real drivers of harm, and called for solutions designed with communities rather than imposed on them. A government response assembled in 6 days that suspended the country's own racial discrimination law in order to deploy soldiers, quarantine welfare payments, and seize control of Aboriginal land, all without using the word children anywhere in the actual legislation, the report's own authors publicly objecting to exactly the parts of the response that went furthest beyond anything they'd actually recommended. Elders who responded by walking out of their own government provided houses rather than keep living under it. A change of federal government that changed almost nothing about the policy itself, restoring the Racial Discrimination Act 3 full years later than it could have, only months after formally apologising for an entirely different era of government control over Aboriginal lives, and a body of independent evidence gathered over more than a decade that's never managed to show the core measures actually did what they were said to be for, even as versions of the same income management model have continued operating in one form or another for nearly 2 decades since. There's a pattern worth naming plainly here, one this show has circled more than once. A real, serious problem gets identified, often by Aboriginal people themselves, often after years of being ignored. A government then uses that real problem as cover to implement a set of measures considerably broader, more punitive, and more politically convenient than anything the original evidence actually called for. Little children are sacred deserved an answer. What it got, instead, was an emergency declared in its name that its own authors spent the years afterward trying, mostly unsuccessfully, to walk back. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a Three Brothers production. I'll see you next time.